The first death, the first scream shattered the quiet long before dawn. It was a sound no one at Whitmore Seminary would ever forget. A raw, primal shriek that sliced through the snow-choked darkness and sent every student bolt upright in their narrow beds. For a moment the halls were still. Then came the second scream. Longer, hoarser, like an animal being slaughtered somewhere deep within the dormitory. Candles flared to life as doors banged open and half-dressed young men spilled into the corridor, their breath fogging in the icy air. And then silence. A silence so complete it felt wrong, as though the entire building was holding its breath. David Crane was the first to run toward the sound, his bare feet slapping against the frozen floorboards. The hall seemed unnaturally long, the shadows stretching and twisting in the flickering candlelight. When he threw open the door to his roommate's room, he found Thomas Milliken writhing on the bed, his body arched so violently it seemed his spine would snap. His hands clawed the air, nails as black as pitch, and from his mouth poured a stream of words that no one in that building should have understood. Yet every man who heard them felt the same instinctive chill. Something holy was being profaned. The seminary in Winter Whitmore. Seminary stood like a gray stone sentinel on 200 acres of woodland, its chapel steeple pointing heavenward through the heavy Pennsylvania snow. In winter, it was a place of cloistered devotion, the isolation enforcing a near monastic rhythm of study, prayer, and self-examination. The only sounds were the scrape of quills on parchment, the wind keening through the bare trees, and the evening hymns drifting from the chapel. But that winter of 1823, something had shifted. The students could feel it even before Thomas's convulsions, a tension in the air, as though the land itself were waiting for something to happen. Dreams became strange, fevered. Dogs in the village howled at nothing for hours. And now this, witness to horror, David shouted for help, his voice echoing through the dormitory like a trumpet call. Within minutes, the hallway was crowded with wide-eyed students, their faces pale as moonlight as they watched Thomas's body thrash and twist against the bed frame. His eyes had rolled back to whites, and the words spilling from him grew more guttural, more mocking, until even the most rational among them began to cross themselves. Dr. Cornelius Ashford, the seminary's head, arrived still in his nightcoat, his face ashen but controlled. Behind him came Sarah Ashford, clutching a lantern that threw wild, leaping shadows on the walls. When Dr. Ashford heard the Latin phrases, inverted prayers, twisted benedictions, his expression tightened, but he barked orders like a field commander. Hold him down. Fetch Dr. Whitley, and for God's sake, keep the others back. The arrival of the physician doctor, Edmund Whitley, rode hard through the snow from the town of Millbrook, arriving just before dawn, his breath steaming as he dismounted. He had been practicing medicine for 30 years and thought he had seen everything a human body could do. But when he entered Thomas's room, the sight nearly made him drop his bag. The student's hands were entirely black now, the color spreading up his forearms like ink through paper. His pulse alternated between a frantic gallop and a whisper so faint it seemed ready to stop entirely. Whitley tried every remedy in his arsenal: bleeding, laudanum, cold compresses, but the symptoms didn't change. Worse, the room had taken on a smell that none of them could explain, a sulfurous stench like rotting eggs that clung to the curtains and made several students gag. The first death by nightfall, the convulsions slowed. The guttural words became whispers, then stopped. For a moment, they thought the crisis had passed, but Thomas suddenly sat upright, eyes wide, face deathly pale. "The book," he said clearly, every word a dagger of dread. "The book in the chapel. God forgive us all," and then he collapsed. When they laid him out for burial the next morning, his skin was white as parchment, and the black stains had completely vanished, but the fear remained, foreshadowing the plague. The funeral was held 2 days later. The entire seminary gathered in the snow-dusted graveyard behind the chapel. Dr. Ashford delivered a solemn eulogy, reminding them of life's fragility and the hope of resurrection. Yet even as the words echoed across the frozen ground, the students could not shake the image of Thomas's final, terrified gaze. That night, no one slept. They huddled in the common rooms, whispering theories. Was it disease? Poison? Punishment? Somewhere in the darkness, a chapel bell tolled once, though no one was there to ring it. And then, exactly 5 nights after Thomas's death, another scream rang out. Echoes in the walls. The scream this time was muffled. as though it had come from inside the walls. It was just past 3 in the morning when James Morrison's roommate, William Foster, jolted awake to the sound. Not the raw, wild shriek they had heard from Thomas. No, this was lower, more deliberate, like a voice caught between a cry and a chant. The sound seemed to slither through the stone, rising and falling in a slow, unnatural cadence that made the hairs on William's arms lift despite the biting cold. He sat upright, the darkness pressing around him like a shroud, and then he realized James wasn't in his bed. A faint glow bled under the door. William crossed the room barefoot, every board creaking like it might scream in protest. He pushed the door open a crack and froze. James was standing at the far end of the corridor, naked to the waist, his back a lattice of goose flesh and sweat. In each of his hands, his fingernails were black as coal. He was facing the stone wall, whispering to it. And the wall was whispering back. A pattern of madness. The dormitory erupted into chaos again, just as it had with Thomas, but this time the hysteria spread faster. They tried to carry James back to his room, but he fought them with the strength of a man possessed. His mouth poured out strings of Latin, each phrase an exact echo of the ones Thomas had screamed days earlier, yet spoken with unnerving calm, as if reciting scripture. Dr. Whitley arrived in record time, his face gray with exhaustion, his eyes glittering with fear he no longer tried to hide. As he examined James, he realized something far more disturbing than before. James's body temperature was falling even as his pulse raced. He was burning from the inside out while freezing from the outside in, a contradiction that made no medical sense. When Dr. Whitley pricked James's arm for blood, it oozed like thick ink and congealed on the cloth almost instantly. "Dear God," he muttered, "it's happening again. The seminary fractures by morning." Word had spread through Whitmore Seminary like wildfire, and something broke in the atmosphere that day. Before, fear had been a silent undertow. Now it surged into open panic. Chapel attendance swelled, prayers became frantic, and the sharp-eyed professors found themselves teaching to rooms full of hollow faces. Even the surrounding woods seemed to conspire against them, the trees groaning in the wind, their limbs scratching the windows like bony fingers. Some students swore they heard footsteps pacing in their empty rooms at night. Others whispered of strange shapes in the chapel windows, shadows that shifted when no one stood there. One boy swore he heard Thomas's voice whisper his name from behind the locked chapel doors. He didn't sleep for 3 nights after. James's final hour, James died. Just like Thomas, and precisely 21 hours after his first convulsions. But unlike Thomas, he did not thrash or scream in those last minutes. He grew perfectly still. His breath slowed, his eyes opened wide, and he smiled, a thin, cold smile that did not reach his eyes. Then, just before his final breath, he whispered, "The book. The book in the chapel. God forgive us all." And just like Thomas, the black drained from his flesh the moment his heart stopped, leaving behind a young man who looked almost peacefully asleep. Dr. Whitley stood over the body longer than anyone else, jaw clenched so hard the muscle jumped in his cheek. "This is no disease," he said finally. "Diseases do not learn, and this one is learning." Things in the dark that night, the seminary went into full lockdown. Dr. Ashford ordered every door barred and every student confined to their dormitories. Candles burned in every hallway, casting twitching shadows on the old limestone walls. Yet still the sounds came, whispers bleeding through stone, footsteps in empty rooms, soft scraping, like nails dragging across the wood beams overhead. Timothy Brennan, the youngest student, lay awake until dawn, clutching his Bible so tightly the leather cover creased. When he blinked, he swore he saw someone standing at the foot of his bed, tall, featureless, its hands folded as if in prayer. He screamed. When the other boys rushed in, the figure was gone, but the floorboards where it had stood were wet, as though something had just stepped out of water. Foreshadow of the third. 3 days later, as the clock struck 3 in the morning, another scream ripped through the seminary. It came from Samuel Brewster's room. By the time the others reached him, Samuel's fingernails were black as ink and he was laughing. The chapel breathes. By the time Samuel Brewster stopped laughing, he was already dead. It had been a dry, hollow laugh, the kind that doesn't belong in a human throat. It echoed through the dormitory long after his heart stopped, bouncing off the stone halls like a ghost trying to remember how to be alive. And just like Thomas and James before him, Samuel's blackened nails faded to pink the instant his body went still, as if whatever had been wearing him had slipped away the moment the vessel was no longer useful. But this time, something was different. The smell stayed. A sour sulfuric reek hung over the body, clinging to the walls and their clothes and their very skin, as though it had seeped into the stone. They burned every linen, scrubbed the floors with lye, opened every window to the howling winter wind. The smell would not leave. Cracks in the clergy. That was the night Dr. Blackwood arrived from Philadelphia. He was older than the other men, silver-haired, eyes like cold steel, and carried himself like someone who had stared down scandal before and won. But even he flinched when he stepped into the dormitory and caught that smell. Sulfur, he murmured, or something older pretending to be sulfur. Dr. Ashford bristled at the implication. He clung to order like a drowning man to driftwood, insisting this was an unknown fever, some quirk of biology. He doubled chapel services, commanding the students to trust in God and the discipline of their routines. But the cracks showed. Professors whispered in empty classrooms. Students prayed through clenched teeth, and everyone avoided looking too long at the chapel, because by now they all felt it. The chapel was watching them back, the book that wasn't their doctor. Whitley, more sleepless than sane, began chasing the victim's final words, the book in the chapel. But when he and Blackwood searched the place by lantern light, they found nothing. The pulpit was hollow stone, the altar unmarked. Pews were overturned, hymnals scattered, the wood floors worn smooth by decades of footsteps, but no book. Still, the chapel felt wrong. Every time their lantern flames guttered, the shadow seemed to move a half-second slower than the light. Whitley could swear he heard breathing, slow and heavy, from somewhere just beyond the edge of the light. Blackwood caught him staring at the rafters and muttered, Don't look up." When Whitley demanded to know why, Blackwood only said, "Because it will look back." The survivors unravel, the students were coming apart at the seams. Timothy Brennan stopped eating. William Foster kept waking up in the hallway, barefooted and blank-eyed with no memory of walking there. Others reported dreams of black shapes perched above their beds, whispering psalms backwards into their ears. Even Marcus Hartwell, the oldest, their rock, began to unravel. Late one night, David Crane found him standing barefoot in the snow outside the chapel, head tilted, listening. The chapel door was shut, but Marcus was nodding as if someone behind it were speaking directly to him. When David touched his shoulder, Marcus hissed like a struck animal. "She's almost here," Marcus whispered. "She's coming through the cracks." Then he collapsed. Sobbing into the snow, the hidden compartment Blackwood, now convinced the students were keeping secrets, began interrogating them in his cold, meticulous way. Most denied knowing anything, but David Crane cracked. Shaking, eyes hollow from sleepless nights, he told them about Thomas finding a loose stone behind the altar, about a hidden compartment, about a book bound in something that might have been human skin, about the nights they had gathered to study it feeling chosen, feeling brilliant, until the headaches came and the voices, and the blackening nails. Blackwood listened without interruption, only nodding once when David admitted, "The book. It's gone. It vanished 3 nights before Thomas fell ill." The color drained from Whitley's face. "Gone?" David nodded. "And it wants to come back." The chapel wakes that night. A wind rose out of nowhere, rattling every shutter. The students huddled in their dormitories while the professors patrolled the halls by candlelight, praying under their breath. Somewhere near midnight, the chapel bell tolled once, though no one had touched the rope. Then came a sound that froze every man in his tracks, a heartbeat, deep and slow, pulsing from the chapel walls themselves, shaking the glass panes in their frames. The heartbeat stopped. The wind died. Silence reclaimed the seminary, and in the morning they found fresh footprints on the chapel roof. Bare human footprints leading to the belfry. The foundation beneath, they sealed the chapel at dawn. Dr. Blackwood ordered iron chains across its heavy oak doors, cold padlocks clicking shut while the students watched from behind frosted windows. The chains rattled faintly even when the wind was still, as if the wood were breathing under restraint. And though the bell was silent now, everyone swore they still felt it, an almost subsonic thrum in their teeth. in the soft tissue behind their eyes, in the marrow of their bones. The seminary's heart was beating, and it was starting to wake up. The forgotten Ledger Blackwood commandeered the seminary's archives next. He and Dr. Whitley spent hours combing through brittle parchment deeds, yellowing ledgers, and centuries-old church correspondence in the cold candlelight of the library's upper room. Dust floated in the lantern glow like drifting ash. Most of the early records were ordinary. Tuition receipts, baptismal certificates, supply orders for ink and coal and bread. But buried near the bottom of an unlabeled crate, Blackwood found something strange. A single sheet of older paper, water-stained and curling at the edges. It was not in English. Not in Latin either. The script writhed across the page in slanted strokes like black vines. The only thing they recognized was the date scrawled in one corner. 1741. That's 80 years before the seminary was built, Whitley whispered. Blackwood just stared at the page. The ink glistened wetly, as if it had only just been written. Millbrook's oldest man to learn what had stood on the land before Whitmore Seminary. Blackwood walked to the village of Millbrook that afternoon, through the skeletal trees and the biting wind that stung like 1,000 needles. He sought out Elias Rowan, a retired stonemason said to be the oldest man in town. Rowan sat in a rocking chair by the fire, his body like dried roots wrapped in a blanket, eyes milked over yet sharp as awls. Before the school, the old man croaked when Blackwood asked. Aye, there were stones here before the churchmen came. Older than anything this side of the Alleghenies. We called it the Black Hollow. He described a circle of monoliths, and 12 of them, sunk half-buried in the clearing where the chapel now stood. Nobody knew who placed them. Livestock would bolt if driven near. Birds would not land on the stones, and snow melted off them no matter how deep the drifts. When they built their chapel, Rowan rasped, they pulled up those stones and buried them, under the foundation, his blind eyes fixed on Blackwood like a nail hammered into wood. But the stones don't stay buried. Patterns. In the deaths back at the seminary, Dr. Whitley mapped the victims' rooms on a sketch of the campus. Thomas, James, Samuel, Peter, Marcus. They formed a near-perfect arc, not random at all, but tracing part of a circle. If completed, the circle's center would land squarely on the chapel's altar. When he showed the map to Blackwood, the churchman just stared at it, lips pressed white. It's not killing them, Blackwood said slowly. It's in arranging them. The return of the book. That night, snow hammered the windows like thrown gravel. The students huddled together for warmth, whispering prayers they could no longer believe in. David Crane sat alone in the library, clutching a candle and shivering even though the fire roared. And then he saw it. The book. It was sitting upright on the table in front of him, though he had not heard it placed there. Its cover looked slick like cured hide, and its pages breathed in and out as though drawing air. There was frost on the table, a perfect ring around the book. David's candle guttered out. The darkness pressed closer, heavy and wet, and he swore he heard a whisper just behind his ear. You are the last door. The 6th is chosen at dawn. Marcus Hartwell was found kneeling in the snow outside the chained chapel doors. His eyes were open, his fingernails were black, and he was smiling. He did not resist as they carried him inside. He did not speak except to whisper one phrase over and over until his voice cracked into silence. She is waking, and she remembers her name. The walls begin to breathe. Out snow fell like sifted ash over the chained chapel, muffling every sound except the heartbeat. It pulsed through the stones now, not just the chapel, the dormitories, the dining hall, the library. Every wall ticked like muscle. Every floorboard flexed. When the wind cut through the courtyard, it no longer howled between buildings. It hissed through them. Whitmore Seminary was becoming one body, and it was exhaling. The quarantine cracks. The quarantine finally broke on December 23rd, not from defiance, but from despair. Timothy Brennan smashed his dormitory window with a chair and fled screaming into the snow. 2 others followed, barefoot, sobbing, clawing at their own skin. Dr. Ashford sent faculty after them, but the men returned empty-handed and wild-eyed, whispering that the woods moved wrong and the trees were pointing inward. No one tried again. By sunset, everyone knew there was nowhere to run. The world beyond the gates was gone or had stopped wanting them. Marcus, the prophet Marcus Hartwell, lingered between life and something colder. They bound him to his bed, but the ropes creaked like old wood as he twisted beneath them. His mouth worked constantly, mumbling syllables that blistered the air. When Dr. Whitley tried to take his pulse, Marcus only smiled and whispered, "You mistake us for students. We are vessels." By nightfall, black vines of veinwork spidered across his chest. They pulsed faintly to the rhythm of the chapel's hidden heartbeat, and then his restraints lay empty. Marcus was gone, only the shape of his body remained pressed into the mattress, as though he had been absorbed into the air. The bell rings backwards at midnight. The chapel bell rang again. Not the deep bronze peal they knew, but a thin, metallic scream like torn iron. The sound rippled backward through time. They heard the final echo before the first strike. Every lantern went out. Through the blackness, the snow in the courtyard lifted in a spiraling column like it was falling upward, and above the chapel roof faint lines of light appeared, sketching a vast circle in the air, the same circle Whitley had seen in the victim's dormitory pattern. Only now the circle was almost complete. The contagion of sight by dawn. Half the remaining students were blind, not from injury and their eyes were unmarked, but from something inside. They sat quietly on their beds, hands folded, faces serene and sightless. "Can you see?" Whitley begged one. "Yes," the boy whispered. "She showed us the dark." By afternoon, they began carving the same spiraling symbol into the wooden walls with their fingernails. Some wrote it on their own skin, grinning through tears as their blackened nails scored bloody runes across their arms. Timothy Brennan did not speak at all. He just stood at the window, smiling at the chapel as if waiting for someone to wave back. The last door unlocks on Christmas Eve. The locks on the chapel fell open one by one. No one touched them. The iron chains slithered to the ground like shed skin. The massive oak doors cracked slowly, a beam of black light spilling from the gap, cold and wet like ink. And then Marcus's voice drifted out, clear, calm, and utterly inhuman. 5 have crossed. The 6th will open. The wind died. The students dropped to their knees, weeping, and David Crane, the last survivor of the study group, rose silently to his feet. He walked across the courtyard, snow hissing to steam where he stepped, and placed his trembling hands on the chapel door. It swung inward, and something smiled back. The book without pages. The chapel swallowed David Crane whole. He crossed the threshold, and the black light clung to him like liquid smoke, crawling over his skin as the heavy doors swung shut with the finality of a tomb. Everyone else remained frozen in the courtyard, not from fear. Fear had burned away days ago, but because their limbs simply forgot how to move. The chapel was deciding who would remember how to walk and who would just be walls now. Inside, David heard nothing. And everything. The silence rang. The inverted chapel. The interior had changed. The stone floor sloped downward now into an impossible hollow. Pews curled inward like rib bones. Candles hung in the air, flames inverted, cold blue light that sucked warmth rather than giving it. And at the bottom, where the altar had been, something waited. Not a creature. Not a person, a shape. It was made of absence. Like someone had torn a David-shaped hole out of the universe and forgotten to fill it back in. As he approached, its edges rippled, and with every ripple, the air whispered in every voice he had ever loved. "Read us." The truth of the book. There was no book on the altar, because the chapel itself was the book. The stones they had thought were walls were pages, thousands of years old, pressed thin and etched in symbols so deep they carved through time. The black veins threading through the floor were ink lines, and the students had been sentences. Thomas, James, Samuel, Peter, Marcus. Each of them consumed not by disease but by grammar, rewritten from flesh into script. Their deaths were not deaths. They were edits. David was the last unwritten word. The 6th glyph. The bargain of forgetting. The shape rose as he neared it, impossibly tall and thin, its edges blurring like heat haze. Where its face should have been, David saw the entire seminary, the dormitories, the dining hall, the woods, even the night sky, and all flattened and turning like pages. And then it spoke through him. Using his own heartbeat, 6 began the sentence. 5 became the ink. You may be the period, or the erasure. David understood. If he accepted the final word, he would complete the ritual, become the anchor, letting the entity cross fully into the world. It would not rampage or destroy. It would overwrite. Reality would quietly become something else, and no one would remember it had ever been different. If he refused, it would erase everything here. The seminary, the students, the land itself, as though none of it had ever existed. No graves, no names. Either way, there would be no survivors, only silence. The last word, David thought of Thomas's laughter echoing through the dormitory halls, of Samuel's easy jokes, of Marcus's quiet grief and towering resolve. He thought of Timothy, barely 18, waiting at the window for someone who would never wave back, and he smiled through his tears. I choose neither, he whispered. I choose to close the book. He stepped forward and spoke their names, every one of them. Slowly, carefully, like sealing a door. The chapel screamed, not in sound, in memory. Candles shattered in reverse, flames imploding. The walls folded inward like pages torn free. The stone floor unspooled into ash. The shape shrieked as it came apart letter by letter, unmaking itself. And then everything went very, very quiet. After the ash, when the search party from Philadelphia arrived weeks later, they found nothing. No buildings, no bodies. No chapel. Only a snow-dusted clearing of bare earth in the middle of the forest, perfectly circular and utterly still. Millbrook Village lay abandoned. The roads were gone as if they had never been cut, and at the center of the clearing stood a single stone, half buried, black as ink, carved with one word in Latin, silentium. No one could remember what had stood there. They only knew not to speak too loudly when they passed through those woods, because sometimes the air still turns its own pages.